The vampire stopped. Some time before, the boy had been about to light a cigarette, and now he sat with a match in one hand, the cigarette in the other, still as a store dummy, staring at the vampire. The vampire was looking at the floor. He turned suddenly, took the book of matches from the boy's hand, struck the match, and held it out. The boy bent the cigarette to receive it. He inhaled and let the smoke out quickly. He uncapped the bottle and took a deep drink, his eyes always on the vampire. He was patient again, waiting until the vampire was ready to resume. I didn't remember Europe from my childhood, not even the voyage to America, really. That I had been born there was an abstract idea, yet it had a hold over me which was as powerful as the hold France can have on a colonial. I spoke French, read French, remembered waiting for the reports of the Revolution and reading the Paris newspaper accounts of Napoleon's victories. I remember the anger I felt when he sold the colony of Louisiana to the United States. How long the mortal Frenchman lived in me I don't know. He was gone by this time, really, but there was in me that great desire to see Europe and to know it, which comes not only from the reading of all the literature and the philosophy, but from the feeling of having been shaped by Europe more deeply and keenly than the rest of Americans. I was a Creole who wanted to see where it had all begun. And so I turned my mind to this now, to divesting my closets and trunks of everything that was not essential to me, and very little was essential to me really, and much of that might remain in the townhouse, to which I was certain I would return sooner or later, if only to move my possessions to another similar one and start a new life in New Orleans. I couldn't conceive of leaving it forever. Wouldn't. But I fixed my mind and heart on Europe. It began to penetrate for the first time that I might see the world if I wanted, that I was, as Claudia said, free. Meantime, she had a plan. It was her idea most definitely that we must go to Central Europe, where the vampire seemed most prevalent. She was certain we could find something there that would instruct us, explain our origins. But she seemed anxious for more than answers, a communion with her own kind. She mentioned this over and over. My own kind. And she said it with a different intonation than I might have used. She made me feel the gulf that separated us. In the first years of our life together, I had thought her like Lestat, imbibing his instinct to kill, though she shared my tastes in everything else. Now I knew her to be less human than either of us, less human than either of us might have dreamed. Not the faintest conception bound her to the sympathies of human existence. Perhaps this explained why, despite everything I had done or failed to do, she clung to me. I was not her own kind, merely the closest thing to it. But wouldn't it have been possible, asked the boy suddenly, to instruct her in the ways of the human heart, the way you'd instructed her in everything else? To what avail? Asked the vampire frankly. So she might suffer as I did? Oh, I'll grant you I should have taught her something to prevail against her desire to kill Lestat. For my own sake I should have done that. But you see, I had no confidence in anything else. Once fallen from grace, I had confidence in nothing. The boy nodded. I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were coming to something, he said. Only to the point that it was possible to forget that what had happened to Lestat. Only to the point that it was possible to forget what had happened to Lestat by turning my mind to Europe, and the thought of the other vampires inspired me also. I had not been cynical for one moment about the existence of God, only lost from it, drifting preternatural, through the natural world. But we had another matter before we left for Europe. Oh, a great deal happened indeed. It began with the musician. He had called while I was gone that evening to the cathedral, and the next night he was to come again. I had dismissed the servants and went down to him myself, and his appearance startled me at once. He was much thinner than I'd remembered him, and very pale, with a moist gleam about his face that suggested fever, and he was perfectly miserable. When I'd told him Lestat had gone away, he refused at first to believe me, and began insisting Lestat would have left him some message, something, and then he went off up the Rue Royale, talking to himself about it, as if he had little awareness of anyone around him. I caught up with him under a gas lamp. "He did leave you something," I said quickly, feeling for my wallet. I didn't know how much I had in it, but I planned to give it to him. It was several $100s. I put it into his hands. They were so thin I could see the blue veins pulsing beneath the watery skin. Now he became exultant, and I sensed at once that the matter was beyond the money. "Then he spoke of me. He told you to give this to me," he said, holding on to it as though it were a relic. "He must have said something else to you." He stared at me with bulging, tortured eyes. I didn't answer him at once, because during these moments I had seen the puncture wounds in his neck. 2 red scratch-like marks to the right, just above his soiled collar. The money flapped in his hand. He was oblivious to the evening traffic of the street, the people who pushed close around us. "Put it away," I whispered. "He did speak of you, that it was important you go on with your music." He stared at me as if anticipating something else. "Yes, did he say anything else?" he asked me. I didn't know what to tell him. I would have made up anything if it would have given him comfort, and also kept him away. It was painful for me to speak of Lestat. The words evaporated on my lips, and the puncture wounds amazed me. I couldn't fathom this. I was saying nonsense to the boy finally, that Lestat wished him well, that he had to take a steamboat up to St. Louis, that he would be back, that war was imminent and he had business there. The boy hungering after every word, as if he couldn't possibly get enough and was pushing on with it for the thing he wanted. He was trembling. The sweat broke out fresh on his forehead, as he stood there pressing me, and suddenly he bit his lip hard and said, But why did he go?" As if nothing would suffice. "What is it?" I asked him. "What did you need from him? I'm sure he would want me to—" "He was my friend!" He turned on me suddenly, his voice dropping with repressed outrage. "You're not well," I said to him. "You need rest. There's something," and now I pointed to it, attentive to his every move, "on your throat." He didn't even know what I meant. His fingers searched for the place, found it, rubbed it. "What does it matter? I don't know. The insects, they're everywhere," he said, turning away from me. "Did he say anything else?" For a long while I watched him move up the Rue Royale, a frantic, lanky figure in rusty black, for whom the bulk of the traffic made way. I told Claudia at once about the wound on his throat. It was our last night in New Orleans. We'd board the ship just before midnight tomorrow for an early morning departure. We had agreed to walk out together. She was being solicitous, and there was something remarkably sad in her face, something which had not left after she had cried. "What could the marks mean?" she asked me now. "That he fed on the boy when the boy slept? That the boy allowed it? I can't imagine," she said. Yes, that must be what it is, but I was uncertain. I remembered now Lestat's remark to Claudia that he knew a boy who would make a better vampire than she. Had he planned to do that? Planned to make another one of us? "It doesn't matter now, Louis," she reminded me. We had to say our farewell to New Orleans. We were walking away from the crowds of the Rue Royale. My senses were keen all around me, holding it close, reluctant to say this was the last night. The old French city had been for the most part burned a long time ago, and the architecture of these days was as it is now, Spanish, which meant that, as we walked slowly through the very narrow street where one cabriolet had to stop for another, we passed whitewashed walls and great courtyard gates that revealed distant lamplit courtyard paradises like our own, only each seemed to hold such promise, such sensual mystery. Great banana trees stroked the galleries of the inner courts, and masses of fern and flower crowded the mouth of the passage. Above, in the dark, figures sat on the balconies, their backs to the open doors, their hushed voices and the flapping of their fans barely audible above the soft river breeze, and over the walls grew wisteria and passiflora so thick that we could brush against it as we passed, and stop occasionally at this place or that to pluck a luminescent rose or tendrils of honeysuckle. Through the high windows we saw again and again the play of candlelight on richly embossed plaster ceilings, and often the bright iridescent wreath of a crystal chandelier. Occasionally a figure dressed for evening appeared at the railings, the glitter of jewels at her throat, her perfume adding a lush evanescent spice to the flowers in the air. We had our favourite streets, gardens, corners, but inevitably we reached the outskirts of the old city and saw the rise of the swamp. Carriage after carriage passed us coming in from the Bayeux Road, bound for the theatre or the opera. But now the lights of the city lay behind us, and its mingled scents were drowned in the thick odour of swamp decay. The very sight of the tall, wavering trees, their limbs hung with moss, had sickened me, made me think of Lestat. I was thinking of him as I'd thought of my brother's body. I was seeing him sunk deep among the roots of the cypress and oak, that hideous withered form folded in the white sheet. I wondered if the creatures of the dark shunned him, knowing instinctively the parched, crackling thing there was virulent, or whether they swarmed about him in the reeking water, picking his ancient dried flesh from the bones. I turned away from the swamps, back to the heart of the old city, and felt the gentle press of Claudia's hand comforting. She had gathered a natural bouquet from all the garden walls, and she held it crushed to her bosom of her yellow dress, her face buried in its perfume. Now she said to me in such a whisper that I bent my ear to hear, "Louis, it troubles you. You know the remedy. Let the flesh instruct the mind." She let my hand go, and I watched her move away from me, turning once to whisper the same command. "Forget him. Let the flesh instruct the mind." It brought back to me that book of poems I'd held in my hand when she first spoke these words to me, and I saw the verse upon the page. Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was as white as leprosy, the nightmare life in death was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. She was smiling from the far corner, a bit of yellow silk visible for a moment in the narrowing dark, then gone. My companion forever. I was turning into the Rue de Maine, moving past darkened windows. A lamp died very slowly behind a broad scrim of heavy lace, the shadow of the pattern on the brick expanding, growing fainter, then vanishing into blackness. I moved on, nearing the house of Madame Leclerc, hearing faint but shrill the violins from the upstairs parlour, and then the thin metallic laughter of the guests. I stood across from the house in the shadows, seeing a small handful of them moving in the lighted rooms. From window to window to window moved one guest, a pale lemon-coloured wine in his stem glass, his face turned towards the moon as if he sought something from a better vantage, and found it finally at the last window, his hand on the dark drape. Across from me a door stood open in the brick wall, and a light fell on the passage at the far end. I moved silently over the narrow street, and met the thick aromas of the kitchen rising on the air past the gate. the slightly nauseating smell of cooking meat. I stepped into the passage. Someone had just walked fast across the courtyard and shut a rear door. But then I saw another figure. She stood by the kitchen fire, a lean black woman with a brilliant tignon around her head, her features delicately chiseled and gleaming in the light like a figure in diorite. She stirred the mixture in the kettle. I caught the sweet smell of the spices and the fresh green of marjoram and bay, and then in a wave came the horrid smell of the cooking meat, the blood and flesh decaying in the boiling fluids. I drew near and saw her set down her long iron spoon and stand with her hands on the generous tapered hips, the white of her apron sash outlining her small, fine waist. The juices of the pot foamed on the lip and spit in the glowing coals below. Her dark odor came to me, her dusky, spiced perfume, stronger than the curious mixture from the pot, tantalizing as I drew nearer and rested back against the wall of matted vine. Upstairs, the thin violins began a waltz, and the floorboards groaned with the dancing couples. The jasmine of the wall enclosed me, and then receded like water leaving the clean-swept beach, and again I sensed her salt perfume. She had moved to the kitchen door, her long black neck gracefully bent as she peered into the shadows beneath the lighted window. "Monsieur," she said, and stepped out now into the shaft of yellow light. It fell on her great round breasts and long sleek silken arms, and now on the long cold beauty of her face. "You're looking for the party, monsieur?" she asked. "The party's upstairs." "No, my dear, I wasn't looking for the party," I said to her, moving forward out of the shadows. "I was looking for you." Everything was ready when I awoke the next evening. The wardrobe trunk on its way to the ship, as well as a chest which contained a coffin, the servants gone, the furnishings draped in white, the sight of the tickets and a collection of notes of credit and some other papers all placed together in a flat black wallet made the trip emerge into the bright light of reality. I would have forgone killing had that been possible, and so I took care of this airily and perfunctorily, sorry, I may have mispronounced that, as did Claudia. And as it neared time for us to leave, I was alone in the flat, waiting for her. She had been gone too long for my nervous frame of mind. I feared for her, though she could bewitch almost anyone into assisting her if she found herself too far away from home, and had many times persuaded strangers to bring her to her very door, to her father, who thanked them profusely for returning his lost daughter. When she came now she was running, and I fancied as I put my book down that she had forgotten the time. She thought it later than it was. By my pocket watch we had an hour, but the instant she reached the door I knew what was wrong. "Louis, the doors!" she gasped, her chest heaving, her hand at her heart. She ran back down the passage with me behind her, and, as she desperately signalled me, I shut up the doors to the gallery. "What is it?" I asked her. "What's come over you?" But she was moving to the front windows, now the long French windows which opened onto the narrow balconies over the street. She lifted the shade of the lamp and quickly blew out the flame. The room went dark, and then lightened gradually with the illumination of the street. She stood panting, her hand on her breast, and then she reached out for me and drew me close to her beside the window. "Someone followed me," she whispered now. "I could hear him block after block behind me. At first I thought it was nothing." She stopped for breath, her face blanched in the bluish light that came from the windows across the way. "Louis, it was the musician," she whispered. "But what does that matter? He must have seen you with Lestat." "Louis, he's down there. Look out the window. Try to see him." She seemed so shaken, almost afraid, as if she would not stand exposed on the threshold. I stepped out on the balcony, though I held her hand as she hovered by the drape, and she held me so tightly that it seemed she feared for me. It was 11 o'clock, and the Rue Royale for the moment was quiet. Shops shut. The traffic of the theatre just gone away. A door slammed somewhere to my right, and I saw a woman and a man emerge and hurry towards the corner, the woman's face hidden beneath an enormous white hat. Their steps died away. I could see no one, sense no one. I could hear Claudia's labored breathing. Something stirred in the house. I started, then recognized it as the jingling and rustling of the birds. We'd forgotten the birds. But Claudia had started worse than I, and she pulled near to me. "There is no one, Claudia," I started to whisper to her. Then I saw the musician. He had been standing That's weirdly formulated. Then I saw the musician. He had been standing so still in the doorway of the furniture shop that I had been totally unaware of him, and he must have wanted this to be so, for now he turned his face upwards towards me, and it shone from the dark like a white light. The frustration and care were utterly erased from his stark features. His great dark eyes peered at me from the white flesh. He had become a vampire. "I see him," I murmured to her, my lips as still as possible, my eyes holding his eyes. I felt her move closer, her hand trembling, a heart beating in the palm of her hand. She let out a gasp, and then she saw him now. But at that same moment, something chilled me even as I stared at him, and he did not move, because I heard a step in the lower passage. I heard the gate hinge groan, and then that step again, deliberate, loud, echoing under the arched ceiling of the carriageway, deliberate, familiar. That step advancing now up the spiral stairs. A thin scream rose from Claudia, and then she caught it at once with her hand. The vampire in the furniture store had not moved, and I knew the step on the stairs. I knew the step on the porch. It was Lestat. Lestat pulling on the door, now pounding on it, now ripping at it, as if to tear it loose from the very wall. Claudia moved back into the corner of the room, her body bent, as if someone had struck her a sharp blow, her eyes moving frantically from the figure in the street to me. The pounding on the door grew louder, and then I heard his voice. "Louis," he called to me. "Louis!" he roared against the door. And then came the smash of the back parlor window, and I could hear the latch turning from within. Quickly I grabbed the lamp, struck a match hard, and broke it in my frenzy. Then got the flames as I wanted it and held the small vessel of kerosene poised in my hand. "Get away from the window. Shut it," I told her. And she obeyed as if the sudden, clear, spoken command released her from a paroxysm of fear. "And light the other lamps now, at once," I heard her crying as she struck the match. Lestat was coming down the hallway. And then she stood at the door. I let out a gasp, and not meaning to, I must have taken several steps backwards when I saw him. I could hear Claudia's cry. It was Lestat beyond question, restored and intact as he hung in the doorway, his head thrust forward, his eyes bulging as if he were drunk and needed the door jamb to keep him from plunging headlong into the room. His skin was a mass of scars, a hideous covering of injured flesh, as though every wrinkle of his death had left its mark upon him. He was seared and marked as if by the random strokes of a hot poker, and his once clear grey eyes were now shot with hemorrhaged vessels. "Stay back, for the love of God," I whispered. "I'll throw it at you. I'll burn you alive," I said to him, and at that same moment I could hear a sound to my left, something scraping, scratching against the facade of the townhouse. It was the other one. I saw his hands now on the wrought iron balcony. Claudia let out a piercing scream as he threw his weight against the glass doors. I cannot tell you all that happened then. I cannot possibly recount it as it was. I remember heaving the lamp at Lestat. It smashed at his feet, and the flames rose at once from the carpet. I had a torch then in my hands, a great tangle of sheet I'd pulled from the couch and ignited in the flames. But I was struggling with him before that, kicking and driving savagely at his great strength. And somewhere in the background were Claudia's panicked screams, and the other lamp was broken, and the drapes of the windows blazed. I remember that his clothes reeked of kerosene, and that he was at one point smacking wildly at the flames. He was clumsy, sick, unable to keep his balance, but when he had me in his grip, I even tore at his fingers with my teeth to get him off. There was noise rising in the street, shouts, the sound of a bell. The room itself had fast become an inferno, and I did see in one clear blast of light Claudia battling the fledgling vampire. He seemed unable to close his hands on her, like a clumsy human after a bird. I remember rolling over and over with Lestat in the flames, feeling the suffocating heat in my face, seeing the flames above his back when I rolled under him. And then Claudia rose up out of the confusion and was striking at him over and over with the poker until his grip broke loose and I scrambled over him. I saw the poker coming down again and again on him, and could hear the snarls rising from Claudia in time with the poker, like the stress of an unconscious animal. Lestat was holding his hand, his face a grimace of pain, and there, sprawled on the smouldering carpet, lay the other one, blood flowing from his head. What happened then is not clear to me. I think I grabbed the poker from her and gave him one final blow with it to the side of the head. I remember that he seemed unstoppable, invulnerable to the blows. The heat by this time was singeing my clothes, had caught Claudia's gossamer gown, so I grabbed her up and ran down the passage trying to stifle the flames with my body. I remember taking off my coat and beating at the flames in the open air, and men rushing up the stairs and past me. A great crowd swelled from the passage into the courtyard, and someone stood on the sloped roof of the brick kitchen. I had Claudia in my arms now, and was rushing past them all, oblivious to the questions, thrusting a shoulder through them, making them divide. And then I was free with her, hearing her pant and sob in my ear, running blindly down the Rue Royale, down the first narrow street, running and running until there was no sound but the sound of my running, and her breath, and we stood there, the man and the child, scorched and aching, and breathing deep in the quiet of night. And that is where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, so that's another small section of Interview with the Vampire. What's some of the cool things that are going on today? Well, first thing I suppose I should do is I should make a minor amendment to yesterday's point, because thinking off the top of my head, I think I made it sound a lot like Louis no longer believes in God. In fact, I may have very explicitly said that. But Louis does clarify here that he still seems to believe in God in some form, but he appears to be very strongly implying from the previous section that he believes God to have abandoned him. The point that he has completely lost faith still entirely applies, but perhaps he still believes in God as this abstract concept. It doesn't really change the core point, but it's worth noting, and we'll see how his opinion on that subject develops as the story continues. Alright, so, first thing to talk about here, I think, relates to Louis' confrontation with the musician boy. And one of the things I think we see in this character is that the musician highlights the effects of Lestat's abuse from an outside perspective. Louis gets to see for himself what Lestat's manipulation and abuse looks like in another person. The boy has become so reliant on Lestat that he is economically and emotionally breaking down without him. Which just highlights the level that Lestat gets into people's head and tries to take complete control of their lives. and build this obsession and need for him. Of course, amusingly, the only way Louis seems to know how to fix this problem is to give the boy money. When he sees the boy is having a breakdown, Louis just takes a bunch of money out of his wallet and hands it to him. That's very typical of Louis. I think Louis' attitude to most things is, how can I use my money to solve this problem? Because he has lived his entire life using his money to avoid problems and to avoid the consequences of his actions. So that's very fitting. More stuff to talk about, I guess. Louis is talking about Claudia, and he recalls a quote from a book he was reading when he was looking at Claudia once. And that quote happens to be an extract from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I'm not massively familiar with the details of that particular piece of work, but I think it is fitting that he recalls reading from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because they are about to go to sea in this segment. So it is a bit of subtle foreshadowing in that regard, but it's also relevant in that his description of her as this monstrous, quote-unquote beautifully monstrous creature is very, very fitting for the description of Claudia. Louis, in regards to this voyage they're about to undergo, he talks about this desire to see Europe. And he explains this in regards into just wanting to see the nation that made him, because he doesn't actually recall what Europe was like. And I think that's valid, but I think also on a thematic level, returning to this notion of like strange alternative reverse colonization, like reverse colonization in reverse. He wants to see the nation that made him in a more symbolic sense, because, as I've said, Europe is responsible for the colonialism that a character like Louis represents, and in his return to Europe, he is wreaking havoc upon Europe, and he is in some way returning that horror back to where it came from, essentially. Also, I mean, it is also worth noting that they're going to go to Central and Eastern Europe over the course of this story, which isn't quite as accurate. It kind of throws a bit of a spanner into that potential reading, but then you can just talk about it in regards to the colonial influence being put into Eastern Europe, and Louis and other characters' opinions of the people they meet in Eastern Europe will be particularly interesting to discuss when it comes up, because there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about there, especially stuff relating to more traditional vampire tales, because of course vampire tales are classically set in Eastern Europe, which is why they're going there in the first place, because that's what Claudia has been researching. Okay. The main event of this section of the novel is Lestat's return. Obviously, Claudia has failed to kill Lestat properly. She poisoned him, she stabbed him, she drank his blood, she had Louis tie him down and drop him into a swamp, but none of this appears to have been successful in actually killing Lestat. And Lestat has somehow been able to escape, feed to recover some of his vitality. He's clearly quite hurt still, but he's also turned the musician boy into a vampire and is now using him to assist in getting his revenge on Claudia and Louis. Something to talk about in regards to killing Lestat is that it is interesting that Louis never suggested the use of fire to Claudia, because using fire to kill vampires is one of the only bits of information about vampires that Lestat gave him. You'll recall back when Babette threw the lamp at him, Lestat put it out saying, it'll consume you up and you'll die. What's interesting in that regard is that it's perhaps a manifestation of Louis's unwillingness to go along with Claudia's plan. Perhaps an unconscious hope within Louis that even though Claudia kills Lestat, he will not actually die because she doesn't know how to kill him, which is, of course, what happens. And with that in mind, it's very interesting that when Lestat returns, Louis's first instinct is to use fire against him. It's very clear that Louis thinks fire can kill vampires, yet he did not tell Claudia this when he had the opportunity. So I think it's very clear that he didn't want Claudia to actually succeed properly in killing Lestat, and I think he's now kind of regretting his decision. Because he instinctively goes to the fire when Lestat returns and attacks them. And this can mean a few things. I think the first thing it represents is his desperation, because it's in a moment and Lestat's about to kill both of them. But it is also very clearly representative of the fact that his loyalty has changed. Where before he was reluctant in his loyalty to Claudia, and he just kind of went along with the plan and didn't provide any assistance with it, such as telling her to use fire, he is now showing his full loyalty to Claudia by immediately using fire against Lestat and telling her also to use fire against the boy. So we're seeing a shift in his attitude there. We'll see how effective that fire actually is as the story progresses, but as far as Louis knows, fire is good to kill vampires. And perhaps it's because Lestat is in this weakened state. Lestat clearly isn't at his full strength, but it is still the case that they are able to defeat him, and pretty easily defeat him, in all honesty. I mean, there's a struggle, but there's never a moment where it looks like they're going to lose. They really get the upper hand almost immediately once they pounce on Lestat. And I think one of the things that this can perhaps indicate is that maybe Lestat wasn't actually that much stronger than them in the first place. I think it definitely ties into this notion that Claudia tries to push, where perhaps Lestat was just another guy. He was just giving illusions of his own power as a mechanism for maintaining control, and to prevent them from ever wanting to rise against him. And then it turns out that when they actually try to, exert their influence and, defeat him, it's surprisingly easy, because at the end of the day, there's no great secret power within him. He just is a vampire, and he doesn't know what he's doing. Canonically, that isn't the case. Canonically, there is a great secret power within him, and he can't die because he has magic blood. But within the context of this story, I think it's really interesting, and I prefer to think of it that way in this regard, because I think it's cool, and you can't stop me. Anyway, this is the second time in the story Louis burns down his own house in order to escape. Louis loves burning down his house, it appears. It makes for very dramatic scenes, I suppose, and it's befitting of the kind of foppery that Louis likes to engage in. Though, I will say, this burning serves a more practical purpose. The burning of Pointe du Lac appeared to be driven very much by emotion. It was a very emotional decision. It wasn't strictly necessary for his escape. Whereas the burning of this house served a more practical purpose. It was more a consequence of his fighting Lestat, rather than a tantrum, essentially. And so that's an interesting thing to look at in regards to Louis' development. Louis is growing a bit more cold as the story progresses. He's becoming a lot less reliant on his emotions, for better and worse, and usually that is for worse in the case of any character, probably. But yeah, we'll see how that develops as the story goes on. That is, within the book, the end of part 1. The book has a number of overarching parts, volumes, I suppose they'd be traditionally, but the book's short enough that it's just in one thing and don't really do volumes anymore to begin with. And so we're moving on to part 2 of the book tomorrow, and that section is going to focus on Louis and Claudia traveling around Europe and the various interesting characters they meet along the way in their search for fellow vampires. I won't spoil you on what they find, but it shall be very, very interesting indeed. So I hope you stay tuned and you listen in tomorrow for the next part of Interview with the Vampire. I'll see you then.